to be told, time for secrets to unfold. It's our time to come of age, time for truth to turn the page. Don't wanna be inside the dark, but live within a question mark. Will be a friend or foe? Tell me now. We need to know. Need to know. We need to
The Extraordinary Phenomenon Investigations Council presents Epic Voyages. Come join us as we enter and experience the great mysteries of the world with tonight's host,
Dr. Joseph Burkes.
Too much to learn, you say. Cover up is fine, that's your plan, not mine. I'm ready to be told, time for secrets to unfold. It's our time to come of age, time for truth to turn the page. Don't wanna be inside the dark, but live within a question mark. Will be a friend or foe? Tell me now. We need to know. Need to know.
Good evening. My name is Dr. Joseph Burkes. I'm a medical physician, and you are listening to Epic Voyages on the Inception Radio Network. Tonight's show is going to be very apropos to current events. We're going to be talking to a world authority about the presidents and the UFO. We have with us on the line Mr. Grant Cameron. And on Facebook, as well as on his internet blog site, he's been going through a detailed analysis of the WikiLeaks disclosures about John Podesta's email. As our audience may be aware, these emails have been made available through hacking into his personal email site, which my understanding is a violation of law. National security investigators, experts, have come to a consensus that this is most likely the result of hacking activities of Russian players, presumably at the behest of the inheritor of the KGB, the FSB, the Russian government intelligence services. So although I'm very excited about the information that's coming out on the UFO subject in these hacks, I'm profoundly disturbed by the source, which many people have complained about in the press as perhaps being an interference with our election. But tonight, show is happening around the time of historic election, and we're going to try to avoid political discussion or any partisan politics tonight and focus on the long-term implications of what these disclosures mean in terms of possible declassification of hitherto secret information that the government holds on UFOs, and perhaps the possibility, although it may be small, of some kind of major disclosure by the President of the United States in the form of possible Hillary Clinton election to that office, a full disclosure of the reality of UFOs and a description of what truly happened in the Roswell event almost 70 years ago. Before I introduce my guest, I'd like to say a few words about myself because the subject is profoundly personal. I've been involved with attempts at informing the public about the reality of UFOs for over 20 years now. I was recruited as a contact activist by Dr. Stephen Greer, who at that time in 1992 was also an emergency room physician. When I discovered that he had a technique of going out into the field and interacting with UFOs, and there was limited communication in the form of signaling back and forth or some telepathic communication. I was very excited because during the 1980s, I had been involved in what we called back then citizens' diplomacy to the former Soviet Union. I was part of an international movement of physicians that were profoundly worried about the growing risks of nuclear war. It was during the Cold War, a time of great conflict, when tens of thousands of nuclear weapons on both sides of the Iron Curtain were arrayed against what were called enemy nations. Our defense structure, in terms of manned missiles, I should say manned bombers, missiles, and submarine-launched rockets, had the potential to destroying life as we knew it, and destroying at least civilization as we knew it. And I got involved in that struggle because I had already been a peace and social justice activist for many years. I grew up in New York City, was in a left-wing Jewish background, and civil rights, demonstrating for peace were activities that I got involved because that's what my family did. As a small child, I recall going to Washington, D.C. during the initial march to Washington demanding desegregation of the United States. Later on, during the nuclear testing era, when the United States and the former Soviet Union were firing into the atmosphere nuclear weapons that were blasting hundreds of millions of metric tons of radioactive material into the atmosphere, I participated in demonstrations that called for an end of this very dangerous practice. Famous pediatrician by the name of Dr. Spock, who wrote a popular book about maternal child care, was involved in a study that collected the baby teeth, the deciduous teeth of children. And what they found back in the late 1950s and early 1960s is that the radioactivity from those nuclear testing was getting into the bones and into the baby teeth of children growing up at the time. And this spurred tremendous action all over the world. Demonstrations occurred primarily from women who often brought their young children along, as I was dragged along by my mom. And so for me, the question of war and peace is very important because growing up in that era, I know that a certain amount of strontium-90 is in my bones, just as everyone else who was drinking the milk that came from the grass that was laden with radioactive nucleotides. So this is my background in terms of peace and social justice activities. As a physician, I worked for 30 years for Kaiser Permanente, the Southern California Permanente group. I had extensive experience in terms of general internal medicine, and I got to successfully retire after 30 years, and I still carry an active medical license, although I'm pretty much retired at this time. Tonight's guest is an author, award-winning UFO investigator, and coming from Canada, I've mentioned before, he's not surprisingly a regular nice guy. Grant Cameron, as a college student in Winnipeg during the 1970s, was involved in investigating a very important wave of sightings that were known as Charlie Red Star. Hundreds and hundreds of people in a remote farming community of Carmen, Manitoba, just 25 miles north of the Canadian-U.S. border, were sighting a very unusual visual display. It was a glowing, pulsating, almost like a human heart UFO that was seen hovering over highways, flying across country fields, and Grant went out and spoke to literally hundreds of people who had had sightings. He wrote that up as a manuscript that unfortunately was not published, although I hear a rumor that it's going to be published soon. I'm looking forward to that. And after the Charlie Red Star investigation, Grant focused on the research and focuses research on the late Wilbur B. Smith, who was a scientist that headed up the Canadian government's UFO investigation during the 50s. It was called Project Magnet. And that investigation is very important because in that investigation of Wilbur Smith, Grant was able to discover the significance of his top secret memo, or letter, I should say, describing what was going on in the UFO field behind closed doors in the United States. Highly secret. In fact, it was considered to be of higher security than the hydrogen bomb program that was going on at that time. Later on, Grant studied Dr. Eric Walker, a powerful UFO scientist who carried out secret research on UFOs following World War II. Grant teamed up with T. Scott Crane to write a book about their investigation of Dr. Walker and other insiders, and it's titled UFOs, Area 51, and the Government Informants, published in 2013. Dr. Walker is also very important in this story because as we describe the work of various insiders, people like John Podesta, Commander Edgar Mitchell, and others, we see a prominent theme of the importance of consciousness. And in studying Dr. Eric Walker, Grant also discovered the importance of consciousness by the things that Walker said when he was interviewed back in the 1990s. For over 2 decades now, Mr. Grant, has conducted a detailed study of the U.S. presidents. And he has made dozens of trips to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and most of the various presidential archives around the United States. So with this introduction, I'd like to welcome Grant. How are you doing there?
Just great, Joe. Thank you very much for your kind intro, and it's an honor to be on your show. I always admire the work you did in the past, and I think we sort of are coming from the same angle when it comes to nuclear weapons and consciousness, and so I'm honored to have a chance to talk to you again.
How cold is it where you are now? I hear Winnipeg is pretty chilly.
Well, actually, it's we have one of the issues of the whole ET and intelligence is we have the global warming, and it's actually very, very warm here. It's way above normal here and expected to be for the next week at least. So quite unusual. But we've had, as I guess many places in the world, we've had maybe one cold year in the last 10, and some of them are just unbelievably warm. So we always say, it depends where you live, whose ox is getting gored. I mean, here, if you talk about global warming, everybody's all for it, although other people are going to suffer. But here, people are quite enjoying the fact that it's known as the coldest major city in the world, but it hasn't been very cold for the last number of years.
Well, we have 70-degree weather here on the left coast of the USA. That's California. And it's pretty warm for us. Usually we have temperature in the 50s and 60s, and we're having a heat wave as well. So global climate change driven by global warming is happening not only in Winnipeg, but also on the Northern California coast. So one of the things I didn't mention in my intro is that for me, this controversy swirling around the WikiLeaks of Podesta's emails is, in a certain sense, a kind of, I experience a sense of deja vu, because I mentioned that I was active in the physicians movement, but I didn't mention that my background also includes being an active UFO investigator, or what I call a contact activist, during the years 1992 to 1998, when I was a CSETI, that's the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence. I was an investigator of the UFO phenomena in what is called now the CE5 initiative, and we'd go out into the field using a protocol that involves consciousness, meditation, thought projection, and believe it or not, we had some limited success in attracting UFOs. And along with that project was something that was not discussed openly for many years, and that was that Dr. Stephen Greer was part of an effort that I find very similar to what we're learning about the Tom DeLonge revelations and his attempt to work with Washington insiders to allow declassification of top secret documents that are pertaining to the UFO subject, and hopefully even a presidential admission that UFOs are real and that Roswell was a real event. So for me, this is kind of like a second dress rehearsal for what I hope is a true open disclosure about the reality of UFOs. And I'll be, during the show, comparing and contrasting this effort with what I was allowed to learn about Dr. Greer's effort. And this is the first time I'm actually talking about the subject in public in this way. So I should hopefully have some interesting things. At least there'll be things that many people have never heard before. So with that as our introduction, let's talk about who is John Podesta and why are his emails so important?
Well, John Podesta is, I just saw another description of him, described by the Washington Post or New York Times, one of the two, as one of Washington's biggest players. He is potentially the most powerful Democrat in the country. He's a political operative who's been around even from the days he met Bill Clinton while going to university. He worked for McGovern's campaign and sort of worked his way up through the years to learn the ropes working with congressmen. And then during the Clinton administration, he spent 6.5 years with the Clinton administration and was very instrumental in a lot of the disclosure material that went on with Bill Clinton. And there's three prime examples. 1994, where Bill Clinton, with an executive order, he signs an executive order that declassifies, as it would say, with one stroke of a pen, 15% of all the material in the National Archives. That was all the World War II records. In 1995, John Podesta was very instrumental in helping Bill Clinton sign an executive order that said that anything over 25 years in terms of classification had to be declassified unless it fit one of 6 exemptions. And it's been estimated that over 1 billion pages of material have been declassified because of that executive order. And then in 1996, he was instrumental in helping Bill Clinton declassify all the Corona satellite photographs and other spy satellite photographs. So he had this very instrumental position with Bill Clinton and was given the position of Bill Clinton's chief of staff for the last 3 years. He was a deputy chief of staff and had been given the job of cleaning up all the various messes, the Bill Clinton messes, the Monica Lewinsky. And he actually did a report on Travelgate in which he actually was very critical of Hillary Clinton in the Travelgate scandal in the Clinton administration. And for a number of years, Hillary Clinton wouldn't even talk to him. But he's a Clinton loyalist. He's been around all the way through, and he sort of takes great pride in identifying the fact that when he believes Bill Clinton is in the wrong, as he did with Monica Lewinsky, he goes and is very, very blunt, right to his face, and tells him what is wrong. And he did the same thing to Hillary Clinton. And so he's sort of like their consciousness that sort of keeps them on the straight and narrow. And he's not afraid to do it, and they trust him, and he's allowed to do this. So you have him now as the campaign manager for Hillary Clinton, and some people say he'll be chief of staff. There's a documentary that's going around going after Podesta now, attacking Podesta, where it says that he's going to be Hillary Clinton's chief of staff. The last I saw him say, he said he's not going to be Hillary Clinton's chief of staff, but he's very instrumental in terms of being this political operative that he knows the ins and outs. He knows how it works in Washington. And he was instrumental in actually picking Barack Obama's cabinet when he came in. He was offered positions in the Barack Obama administration, and he turned them down and said that he wouldn't take the position because he had to be independent in order to pick the Barack Obama people. And he picked a lot of the people that went into the Barack Obama administration come from his think tank. He was the organizer, the founder of the Center for American Progress, which is the big Democratic think tank in Washington, D.C. that does about $45 million worth of consulting business and stuff like that. And so it is, the one figure I saw in 2008 was that 40% of all the high-level officials in the Obama administration came from Podesta's think tank. So Podesta, in terms of putting together the Obama administration, it's basically his people. And so he's very, very powerful and knows how the system works, and is, to me, the thing that impresses me most about him when it comes to the UFO thing is that John Podesta is known as the Madison man. He's very up on James Madison, and James Madison was the president that was big into open government. And Podesta has said on a number of occasions, he gave a major speech on secrecy at Princeton University, and to the CIA, he did a major speech, and he's very open on the fact that you cannot have a democracy unless there is open government, that your ability to vote is negated by the fact that if you don't know what the government is doing, your vote doesn't mean anything. So he's a big guy in terms of open government, and that's where you can see these three initiatives in the Clinton administration where he helped Bill Clinton force out all these documents. So he's big on open government, and he is, of course, the chairman of the Hillary Clinton campaign. He's got the first and last word in the campaign. And he is, as we'll see from the WikiLeaks, he is the guy who's behind some sort of disclosure initiative in terms of disclosing. He is very, very much into UFOs and X-Files. We don't know why. We just know that during the Clinton administration, he was known as the X-Files man. And he even had all this paraphernalia in his the room going into his office in the White House. And his 50th birthday party, the one FOIA that the Clinton Library refused to release to me, was his 50th birthday party, where Bill and Hillary Clinton have an X-Files birthday party for him, and Bill and Hillary dress up as the X-Files. So all the photographs and the one video from that birthday party were denied to me on appeal from the Clinton Library. So he has this very great interest in UFOs, and he has said on a number of occasions, I think people can handle the truth, and it's the law. So these are his two premises why this should be disclosed, which would tend to indicate that even if he knows something, he's tending to indicate that, they're not here to eat us. There's no real bad scenario. He thinks that people can handle whatever the truth is, provided he knows what the truth. But I think in his positions in power, based upon what he said in WikiLeaks and what he said in various interviews during the campaign, I think John Podesta does know how the system works, and that the president does have access to this kind of material. So we can get into that.
Before we talk about that, though, let's talk a little bit about Hillary Clinton's interest in UFOs, because in reading your blogs and your excellent analysis, I've been coming across her statements in the press that you've put together. And by the way, for people listening to this show, I'd like to recommend on YouTube an amazing PowerPoint presentation that Grant just carried out a few days ago. So if you want to learn more about this and actually see the emails, at the end of the program, Grant's going to mention how you can look it up on YouTube. It's 90 minutes. Not only do you get to see the emails, but also have video and audio clips of the important players in this drama, because we're not going to be able to cover it all clearly in the next 90 minutes, but I just wanted people to be aware of that resource. So let's talk about Hillary Clinton and the Clintons' interest in UFOs. Now, you've covered this in a very excellent manner in the book you just published back in March, the Clinton UFO Storybook, ET Politics in the White House. I highly recommend that as well. So let's first talk about Hillary Clinton and what happened back in the 90s.
Okay, Hillary, for whatever reason, it's almost like John Podesta. We really don't know what inspired Hillary Clinton to become interested, but basically what it comes down to is Bill and Hillary are very interested in the subject. I gave one lecture in Eureka Springs. This is going back maybe even 15 years ago, and a woman who came up after claimed to be the sister of the woman who owned the famous barbecue restaurant in Hot Springs, Arkansas, where the Clintons used to hang out. And she said, I know why the Clintons are so interested in UFOs. And she claimed to me that either Bill and Hillary or somebody very close to them had a sighting. and that's why they had this great interest. She said she would look it up. She took my business card, but of course she never contacted me back, so I never got to get that lead. But Bill and Hillary have always had this sort of a spiritual type, religious bend on the way things work. If you remember back during the Clinton administration, the Washington Post exposed Hillary Clinton for this channeling. She was working with Jean Houston, who was her spiritual advisor, and she was doing this sort of a channeling thing where she was talking to Eleanor Roosevelt, to Gandhi, to all these various people, and sort of putting herself in the position of asking questions and stuff like that. And this was exposed by the Washington Post. And Hillary said, well, no, this was more what she was doing. They sort of denied it. And she took a lot of flack as being sort of like the crazy first lady, almost like Nancy Reagan. And that sort of blew over, and nobody's brought it up in this campaign. But they do have this very sort of a new age take on the world. They were bringing in a number of new age people to Camp David when Bill was in the White House, and that all stopped after the Washington Times or the Washington Post did this story. So they have this great interest, and Bill had I guess run up as president with this whole thing. But we just know that they have an interest in the subject. There was even just recently was discovered that Bill Clinton actually, when he was governor of Arkansas, which would be going back into the 1970s, there was the cattle mutilations going back at that time, 75, 76, 77, and Bill Clinton actually initiated a study into cattle mutilations, and we just learned this, so we haven't really gotten any details on what came up to this, but they have this interest.
The point of information that the Clintons wouldn't be the first president to had an interest in these kind of what are called fringe topics. I think it was President Reagan took interest in astrology, and that caused a bit of a furor. Of course, he said it was just curiosity of his, and it's sort of fun and entertainment. But other presidents have been very interested in the UFO phenomena, and by going to your blog or your page, President's UFO, the audience can learn about how many of the presidents, Carter, Reagan, every single one of the presidents has been involved, even Truman, with this subject in one way or another. So in that sense, the Clintons may not be so out of line. Also, yeah. Hillary Clinton, when she was, at least according to her biographers, she was interested in the space race. After all, she grew up in the 1950s when this was very exciting information. We were first going out into space, and she wanted to be apparently an astronaut, and she wrote to NASA. And this was a time when women were lucky if they could get a job in NASA doing secretarial work and other kinds of projects. NASA had a long way to go to break the glass ceiling that held women down. So she wanted to be an astronaut, get out in space, and so many people who are interested in UFOs, their interest started with the space race.
Yeah, she did have that interest, and she does tell the story. She's told it probably a couple times in the 2016 race about the fact that she was basically told by NASA, to get lost, that there was no chance, and she was very influenced by that. I think she was about 12 or 13 when this happened, and she also, so when she was First Lady, she was famous for sort of encouraging Bill Clinton to hire the first female commander of a space shuttle. And so she's had this great interest in the phenomena and in sort of new age spiritual type stuff all the way along. So, and as you said, and a lot of the first ladies had it, like Nancy Reagan had the interest. Rosalind Carter was very interested in Uri Geller, in bending spoons. She actually told Jimmy, come and look at this, and she was, Uri got to bend spoons, and it was Ford's wife that was very interested in UFOs. I always thought it was Ford that, had done some work on UFOs and had done stuff, but apparently it was his wife. So a lot of times it's the first lady that has this sort of interest.
Yeah, so getting back to the Podesta emails, he's called for open government, but I don't think he thought it would be part of that plan that his emails would be exposed to the world. I think that's a little bit over the top in terms of openness. Certainly is illegal. I have to say that being an activist in the UFO subculture has taught me a little bit about emails, and on several occasions, I was an outspoken promoter of the CE5 initiative, and apparently some people didn't like what I was doing because not only was my email hacked, but on more than one occasion, one or several individuals took on the persona of Dr. BURKES using my email address to send out phony emails. And with my name on them. And one of them was having a correspondence with the prominent UFO investigator and historian Richard Dolan. And I don't think I've told this story before. And what happened was, after exchanging emails, I should say, with this individual who was using my web account, he said, "This does not sound like Joe Burks." And the clown that was carrying out that says, "Yes, I'm not." He admitted it. So, and it happened on other occasions too. So, I think that there is something important about privacy that we should acknowledge, and these leaked emails are a profound violation of privacy in terms of electronic communication. So there's
one thing I'd like to discuss on that, and that is that if everybody put their emails out, it would sort of clean up the government. What's happened here is that I can almost guarantee you that Podesta and Hillary and all these people are on their greatest watch to make sure what they say and what they do is clean, because they really don't know now whether somebody else is going to get a hold of these things. And what this is almost like a sort of a pre-alien thing, because this is basically what's going to happen when we get.
Don't miss a great offer on an incredibly fast Fios triple play. Click the banner to get 150 meg internet, TV, and phone for only $79.99 per month for the first year. Plus, you'll get a $150 Visa prepaid card with a 2-year agreement. It's your last chance to get this amazing offer before it's gone.
Sort of the alien telepathic abilities. And what the big difference between humans and alien or ET beings is that they're telepathic. And what you have here is almost like a precursor to this telepathy, that there will be no secrets, that you can't be a politician and stand up there and just sort of say a bunch of stuff and be doing stuff behind the scenes, that everybody will know what you're thinking. So this is it's sort of happening to one side, but you can sort of see what will happen once aliens are telepathic. And once humans learn this ability, is that everything changes, that everything has to get cleaned up, because you can't really, it's almost like war. You can't sneak up on anybody because they know what you're going to do. You can't lie to somebody. They know you're lying. And a lot changes when suddenly everything gets put on the table. The problem here is it's just the democratic stuff that's getting put on the table.
I'm glad you brought up the question of telepathy and consciousness, because as a contact activist, and I was active with the C5 initiative for 5 or 6 years, I would take teams of investigators out into the field, and on 2 occasions I got what is called now telepathic override, where in the course of meditation out in Joshua Tree National Monument the first time, and then in Topanga State Park the second time, in advance, early in the evening, I was given visual as well as abstract information, like an awake dream, in which I was told the number of craft that were going to appear, the part of the sky, and what time it was going to happen. And we had been alerted by Dr. Greer this might ensue, and so I was told, and I did inform my coworkers, showtime in October of '93, showtime is 2 o'clock in the morning. 1 UFO from the northwest is going to come in. And sure enough, right on time, as scheduled, as I was informed, it happened. And this similar thing happened about 8 months later when we were in Topanga Canyon doing a movie shoot for a television journal that was called not Sightings, but Encounters. So this is something that people can do, but I think you have to be really well prepared for it. If we do have open relations with UFO intelligence, it's likely not over weeks, months, or years, but decades, perhaps generations, we will acquire the abilities to use consciousness in a telepathic form. But it's going to take a lot of preparation. And although you put it out there for the listeners to ponder, I can tell you it's not an easy task. You have to be specially trained by UFO intelligence, in my experience, from a very early age, if you're going to have direct telepathic communication. Let's face it, in this culture, if you hear voices in your head, most people are going to say, you have schizophrenia, you're hallucinating, you're delusional. So for this ability to be accepted by the larger society, we're going to have to go through a great deal of maturation. In fact, when I used to have these limited telepathic involvement with the UFO intelligence, I would actually challenge them because, I would have visions, I would hear voice in my head telling me this thing and that thing, and it didn't seem to really give me any new information. One time I said to the being or the voice in my head, why don't you tell me something I don't know so I'll believe that you're not me? And what I got back was kind of sarcastic, and what they said is, if you believe in universal consciousness, as you say you do, Dr. Burkes, what difference does it make whether it's your consciousness or ours? And when I got that message, you know how when you go on a roller coaster and it just drops over the top and your stomach falls out in front of you and you're accelerating at a tremendous speed? Well, I had that same experience, but instead of falling, I felt myself expanding at the speed of light into outer space. And I found myself in my mind's eye, floating in deep space where it was very cold, very dark, and the stars were far away. I knew that was not Joe Burkes. I'd never had what was a proprioceptive hallucination before or since. That was a teaching point. And I was scared. So I think that you can talk about a future of civilization where telepathy is the norm, but it's going to take a heck of a lot of preparation. And I wanted to add that personal vignette. So let's move on then to the Podesta emails in terms of what has been coming out. It's very exciting, but in some ways I feel like I'm seeing a second dress rehearsal for reasons that I'll explain later. So let's talk about those email. There are 3 initiatives that are apparently going on, we know from the email. One has to do with what happened with Commander Edgar Mitchell, Dr. Mitchell, famed lunar astronaut, one of the 12 men who walked on the moon. Then there was another one concerning DeLonge, Tom DeLonge, who's the lead drummer for Blink 182. He's a multimillionaire, having sold some 25 million records. He's head of a multimedia corporation. I'm not sure how accurate this is, but one internet source placed him at his net worth at over $50 million, which if you sell 25 million records, I guess that's not too hard to get to. So let's talk about those two. And I think there's one other. Is that correct?
Those are the 2 main ones. The keys are the DeLonge one is the sort of the explosive one. The Edgar Mitchell one is very interesting. There are probably 18 or 19 emails dealing with 3 women that were working with Edgar Mitchell. One is Rebecca Hardcastle Wright. One was Terry Mansfield. And then there was this Suzanne woman who was sort of the... she's a healer and an intuitive that was around Edgar Mitchell. And when you see these emails, the first question that came up with the emails was, this is not Edgar Mitchell's email, and it's not. It's Terry Mansfield's email. It's Terry Billionaire, and she does work, fundraising work with billionaire people. And so it's her email. Majority of the WikiLeaks stuff coming from Edgar Mitchell is her email. And basically what happened was that Edgar had sort of assigned to these 3 women to get him a meeting first with John Podesta, and then with the President of the United States. And the meeting was to be on UFO disclosure and zero-point energy. And so you'll see these emails going back and forth, and there are actually meetings being set up. Now, the meeting, as far as I know, and I talked to Terry and I've talked to Rebecca, and I've heard indirectly from Suzanne that these meetings never did take place, but there was time set up, and this was an active situation. And there's a couple of interesting things that come up there. One is at one point, the meeting is set up for August of 2014. Edgar Mitchell's to come to Washington, D.C. There's going to be a meeting with John Podesta, and he can't make it for whatever reason. So I believe it was Rebecca wrote back and said, he can't make it. Perhaps John Podesta, myself, and Edgar Mitchell can have a three-way Skype conversation. And Aaron Sepp, who was the assistant to John Podesta, writes back and says, John will do a one-on-one before he takes it to the president, which to me is a... Yeah.
So let me stop you right there. Okay, this is of tremendous significance, because some people will say, well, John Podesta gets emails from lots of people, and although Edgar Mitchell is an American hero and has been outspoken for disclosure, he carried out an ESP experiment when he was on the dark side of the moon. He founded the Institute for Noetic Sciences. I think that's correct. IONS, but John Podesta is, not going to go to the president. And here we have an email going back from John Podesta's secretary or assistant saying that Podesta is prepared after this one-on-one meeting to take it to the president. Is that correct?
Yeah. And then that's significant because a lot of people will debate this, what I call the $64,000 question. Is the president in charge? Is the president constitutionally running the government? Or is this, is there a naval cabal or a, Wizard of Oz or some sort of, breakaway government actually running the government? And what this seems to indicate, and there are a number of these examples in the WikiLeaks thing that seems to indicate that, yes, the president is in charge. And John Podesta is not referring to the fact that I don't know what to do after that, I'll have to see what I can do, or the president isn't in charge, he doesn't know what to do. It's basically, I will go to the president if this works out, which tends to indicate that the president is in charge of this issue.
Exactly. And we should also mention that I got a chance to meet Edgar Mitchell in person, which was quite a thrill back in 1997. You see these people on television, you see them when they're getting out of their space capsule, but to actually meet a man who walked on the moon, to shake his hand, to look into his eyes, that's quite a thrill. And I met him under circumstances that are very apropos in terms of our discussion. In 1997, Stephen Greer and CSETI, and I was still part of the leadership at that time, had what was called behind closed door briefings. And he was collecting witnesses and presenting them to members of Congress and their aides. And one of those meetings took place, behind closed door briefings, in Washington, D.C. in April of 1997. And I was part of the volunteer staff helping set that meeting up. And Edgar Mitchell was there because he was working very closely with Stephen Greer at that time. And so this effort by of many prominent people, including Edgar Mitchell, has been going on for over 20 years. So I wanted just to include that. So continue, please.
And the second big one is the one that sort of really caught me off guard. And you're mentioning Stephen Greer. And Stephen Greer had an interaction with John Podesta as well. He talks about the fact that he passed a bunch of briefing material through John Podesta's lawyer, which John Podesta then in turn took to the president. Now, Stephen's got a different sort of idea that the president really is not totally in control. And so he's providing this briefing material to President Obama to tell him there's a this breakaway group that has to be reined in, and John Podesta takes it to the president. So there's this interaction. But when Edgar Mitchell, this one letter from Edgar Mitchell to the president makes this reference to the fact that Edgar Mitchell doesn't say he's talked about it. He said he's consulted with various presidents on consciousness. And I was just shocked when I saw that, because that sort of changes the whole scenario of what does the government really know. The other big question, one is the president running the cover up? And the other big question is, how much does the government know? Are they, do they know exactly what's going on? Do they understand what the phenomenon is about? Or are they just sort of grasping at straws and they really don't know what's going on? And that's why the cover up is, because they really don't have any control. And when I saw that Edgar Mitchell had consulted with presidents on consciousness, then it suddenly appeared to me that the president realizes the significance of the subject, because I've always said, and you and I both realize, that there's this consciousness aspect that is extremely important and extremely key to this whole subject. Most people are still into the idea that there's, extraterrestrials are flying around in these little tin cans and they got this anti-gravity engine. If we can get the anti-gravity engine out of there, we can, do all sorts of interesting stuff. And the people still in the UFO community, I don't think really, they may know about it, but they don't accept it. That consciousness is a key. It is basically where the rubber hits the road when it comes to the UFO phenomena. And so when I saw that Edgar Mitchell had consulted with presidents, then it was like, yes, maybe they do know what's going on, and they do realize the consciousness aspect to this whole thing, and that the president is read in and he understands this very key part that may be part of the cover-up. Because if you look at, you have things in terms of technology you don't want to give to China or Russia or Al-Qaeda, but you also have this consciousness thing, which to me is much more powerful technology. If you can actually go to a foreign leader and get in their head and talk in their heads, or read their minds and stuff like that, this is very powerful stuff. And so to have this email where Terry Mansfield is mentioning the fact that the president had consulted with Edgar Mitchell on consciousness, a number of presidents. I asked her about it and she didn't respond. But I think what's happened with Terry is that when this thing started to break, she just got inundated with, I guess, reporters and questions. So I contacted her right at the very beginning, and she actually put me in contact with the girl with Von Braun, the woman that used to work for Von Braun, and she answered my questions. But Terry Mansfield really isn't answering any questions. But to me, that was one of the more significant emails that I saw, was this reference to consciousness and the president.
We should define consciousness, although that's impossible, I shouldn't say. We should, because consciousness can't really be defined, but we can describe consciousness. What consciousness is in its simplest form is being awake and knowing you're awake. The awareness of that inner voice, that self, which is a very intimate experience that we all have, all conscious intelligence beings. Presumably, if there are ETs, they are also awake, and they are aware of being awake. And it's important to point out that through consciousness, we can not only remote view distant places, but we can also engage in telepathy, which we've mentioned earlier in the show. When people are asked about their contact experiences, and you've talked about this at length, and they have what they believe are onboard experiences, either physically or mentally, and they are flying the UFOs, they are asked, how are you doing it? And they all give the same expression. They say, we're flying the UFOs with our minds. So this consciousness allows us to communicate to one another, and allows us to remote view distant locations, and is the key to the UFO phenomena. And I think we should just give the audience a view as to how you came to the importance of this subject. I know we've mentioned this in the past, but I think it doesn't hurt to reiterate this, because you had an epiphany back in 2012 where you were able to suddenly connect all the dots in terms of the importance of consciousness. And you used your investigations to serve as the data points. So in the next 10 minutes before we go to the break, let's talk about how you got started with the consciousness connection in terms of your work on Wilbur Smith in the 1950s.
Okay, well, let me just define my impression of consciousness, because when I had this download experience in February 26, 2012, before that I was doing the nuts and bolts. I was doing the U.S. presidents, and I didn't know what consciousness was, couldn't have cared less. And I had this sort of awakening experience. But the way I would define consciousness now is even more fundamental. I'm actually doing I have a draft of a new book I'm going to start, and it has to do with things that we sort of get wrong and we have to evaluate. And the one that we have to evaluate if we want to figure out the equation of UFOs is the world physical or is the world consciousness? And basically, if you look at the quantum physics experiments that have been done, this whole observer experiment that was done with the dual slit experiment now almost 100 years ago, and when Niels Bohr and Heisenberg came up at the 27th Solvay conference and started to introduce this idea that consciousness is primary to the universe. It's not a physical universe. It is consciousness is primary, and that this whole idea that a particle does not take a position in time and space until there's an observer. So the way I look at consciousness is even more fundamental, is to say that everything is consciousness, that the entire universe is consciousness. And you can see this in terms of the famous entangled particle experiment that Einstein hated so much, he called spooky action at a distance, is that if you take two entangled particles and one is going at the speed of light in one direction, one in the speed of light in the other direction, one's on one side of the universe, and the one's on the other side, if you change the spin of the one particle, the other one on the other side of the universe instantaneously will change its spin, which means it's aware. Consciousness is awareness. And that particle is aware of what you did to its buddy. It knows you changed the spin, and it immediately changes, which means to me, almost would you go back to the Solvay conference thing, that consciousness is primary, that everything is made up of consciousness, and that the physical universe is secondary. So when you get into that, then you start to understand why it's so significant, this consciousness thing. And as I said, I had no interest in consciousness whatsoever. And what happened was I was watching a lecture by Colin Andrews, who's the crop circle guy, in Phoenix, Arizona, where you and I met. And I didn't really want to be there. If you know, with the UFO Congress, this big event where it goes from 8 o'clock in the morning till like 11 o'clock at night. And at that time, I think it was going for like 7 days. And you don't go to every lecture, so I really wasn't going to go to Colin Andrews' lecture. And the only reason I went in the lecture was because he was a high-profile researcher, and I figured I should pay him the respect. He's, a major player. And I went in there, no interest in crop circles, no interest in what he was talking about. And he was talking about consciousness in crop circles, how he believed that the beings were creating circles, but they were also telling the hoaxers what kind of circles to put down. It was this idea that they were controlling the consciousness of the hoaxers. So I was in this lecture, and it was the whole idea about inspiration, where you go into an altered state of consciousness where you're really not paying attention. I was thinking about going across to the university, to the library on the other side of the river in Bullhead City, Arizona. Really wasn't interested, and I sort of went in this altered state of consciousness where I really wasn't paying attention, and it happened instantaneously in my head, instantaneously, and it came, and I described this with absolute certainty. You don't have to check this. You don't have to look at this. When you have these kind of experiences, and you've had them, this is different. This is not. It's hard to explain to people.
Well, I think one way to explain it is information at the level of knowledge. It's a kind of knowingness.
Yes.
You know you're a man. You know you're an American, and when you have these contact experiences, you know what you're being told is true.
Yeah, and that was almost the most dramatic part of the whole thing, was I just couldn't believe it. It was like, wow. It was like, how stupid have I been? And it wasn't that, and this is what happens with a lot of these download experiences, is that you have to do all the work. You put all the work together, and then you shut down your ego mind, your left conscious, rational, analytical brain, and the other side, or you sort of tap into the non-local consciousness, and it just puts everything together. And that's what happened, is these three things that I had actually put together, that I had, it just said, this is how they all fit together, all these things. And it was like, wow, that's how it works.
So let's tell the audience, starting with Wilbur Smith's letter. Those data
Wilbur
points.
Smith's letter was I had when I didn't get the manuscript published, I went to see what the Canadian government was doing from 1950 to 54, and Wilbur Smith was a contactee. I went and got all his files, and one of the main documents was a top secret memo that was written in 1950, where Wilbur Smith had gone through classified channels to the Canadian Embassy in Washington, D.C., and he'd asked the Americans, what's the deal with flying saucers? He's asking on behalf of the Canadian government. And it came back and said flying saucers are real. It's the most highly classified subject in the United States. It's of tremendous significance to the Americans, and there's a small group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush. And I used to lecture, and I'd talk about this. Oh, yeah, this top secret memo, and the government doesn't deny it's top secret, and it's for real because the Canadian government has this top secret memo. But what popped into my head at that moment during this download experience was the next line in the document. And the next line said, and we were also told by American officials that other things might be associated with the flying saucers, such as mental phenomena. And the Americans aren't doing very well because they said, if we're working on it, they're willing to exchange credentials and talk to us. So it was this, and that is critically important because in 1950, there was nobody claiming to talk to ETs. There was no contactees. They would not appear till 1952, after a couple days after the detonation of the hydrogen bomb. Betty and Barney Hill's book would not become public till 1966. In 1950, there was nobody talking to aliens. So how did the Canadians know, as told by the Americans, that mental phenomena was part of the UFO phenomena? There was just these things flying around the sky, and there was nobody talking about mental phenomena and stuff like that. And what I imply, and just guessing, is that there may have been a live alien recovered at Roswell, New Mexico, and that's how they knew, because the alien was telepathic. It was talking in their heads, and they realized there was this mental phenomena aspect. And when they looked at the ship, they realized there was no steering wheel, as Cat Stevens in his famous song after he was abducted sings this song, and he said, I was on this ship, the ship of freezing steel, the ship without the guiding wheel. There was no guiding wheel. So they suddenly realized there was this component of telepathy. That was the first thing that popped into my head. The next thing that popped into my head, and this relates to what happens in the WikiLeaks. The second one was the head of Lockheed Skunk Works gives a lecture in 1993, in March 1993, UCLA engineering alumni, and Jan Hartson, the international director for MUFON, is there, and he has this personal experience at 9 years old, close encounter in the backyard, and he's fascinated. He wants to be an engineer, figure out how propulsion works. And during this lecture, Ben Rich, head of Lockheed Skunk Works, says we've discovered the technology to take ET home. We've discovered the mistake in the equation. It's not going to take a lifetime to do, but it's going to take an act of God to get this thing out of Congress. He talks about this. Everybody laughs. Nobody takes him seriously. And at the end, as he's leaving the room, Jan Hartson realizes this is my chance. He goes running after him, and he says, I need to know, Ben. I've been interested in this my whole life. I need to know about the propulsion system. Ben, how do they get here? And he turns around, and he looks at him, and he said, what do you know about ESP? And Jan Hartson said, I didn't expect a question. He said, so he just thought, and he said, it means everything in time and space is connected. And Ben said, that's how it works. And he turns around, gets in his car, and drives away. And then the third thing that popped into my head was Dr. Eric Walker. And Dr. Walker never wanted to talk to us. He said, go study something else. Unless you have the mind of Einstein, you're wasting your time. I don't talk about this subject, because it was classified. He couldn't talk about it. But he couldn't hang up the phone. So people would keep phoning him. And I had all these people around the world phoning him. And at one point, he's being asked about the MJ-12 group, the control group. And the guy from Great Britain says, Dr. Walker, is it still just 12 people, and is it all still Americans, or is it an international group? And Walker says, let me ask you a question. What do you know about ESP? Which seemed totally irrelevant. Like, what's he talking about this for? And he said exactly what Ben Rich would say 2 years later. This is 1991. Ben Rich was 1993. And so he said, what do you know about ESP? And the guy didn't really have an answer. And Walker said, look, unless you understand about ESP and how it works, you will not be taken in. Very few people understand how it works. So Walker is saying the same thing. This ESP thing is a key that unless you understand ESP, you will not be brought into MJ-12. That's the key to getting into that group, is to understand this principle of ESP. So what these three things came and said, it's this non-local. First thought it was consciousness. Then it was later on I realized, no, it was non-local consciousness is talking about. And from then it was like, once I had that download, it was like putting the glasses on. I could suddenly read the stop signs. I could read the street signs, and everything started to make sense, and everything started to fit together.
Thank you so much, Grant. So we can now see that consciousness is the key. It's at the center of the UFO phenomena. And we're going to be going to our break in just a few seconds. For people who are tuning in, I want to tell you that Grant Cameron is our guest tonight. My name is Dr. Joe Burkes. You're listening to the Inception Radio Network, and our show is Epic Voyages. I want to thank the audience for listening in, and I urge you to stay tuned. We're going to have a commercial break in just a few, probably 30 seconds. So, okay, we're going to go to the break. Good evening. Welcome back. You're listening to Epic Voyages on the Inception Radio Network. I'd just like to handle some, how shall we say, housekeeping before we get to our very special